The Strait of Hormuz has once again become the center of a dangerous strategic confrontation between the United States and Iran. But this time, the story is bigger than warships, commercial vessels, or the question of whether ships can safely pass through one of the world's most important maritime choke points. Iran appears to be trying to turn Hormuz itself into leverage. And the price Tehran is putting on the table is enormous. According to the conditions outlined by Iran, Washington would have to make major military, economic, and political concessions before Tehran would consider fully reopening the strategic waterway. That raises a much bigger question. Is Iran really demanding that the United States pay the entire bill? Or is the real objective to make Washington negotiate from a weaker position? Because if that is the strategy, the Strait of Hormuz may be doing far more than disrupting shipping. It may be changing the balance of power across the Middle East. First, consider what Iran is reportedly demanding. On the military side, Tehran wants Washington to end threats, warfare, and military operations directed at Iran and forces associated with Tehran in Lebanon, Palestine, Yemen, and Iraq. Iran also wants U.S. forces withdrawn from the region, an end to the blockade of Iranian ports, and the withdrawal of American air and naval assets from areas surrounding Iran. Taken together, these demands go far beyond a simple agreement over maritime security. If fully implemented, they would amount to a major restructuring of the American military posture in the Middle East. For decades, the United States has built a network of forces, bases, partnerships, and military capabilities across the region. For Washington, that presence is not simply about containing Iran. It is also about supporting allies, maintaining the ability to respond rapidly to crises, and protecting critical maritime routes. So if the United States were to withdraw major forces in exchange for reopening Hormuz, the political message would be difficult to ignore. It could create the perception that enough military pressure on an American interest can force Washington to change its broader strategy. And that is precisely why the military portion of Iran's demands is so difficult for the United States to accept. But the military demands are only one part of the bill. The second part is economic. Iran is also calling for the removal of sanctions, the release of Iranian assets frozen overseas, and compensation for damages that Tehran says were caused by the United States. The figures presented by Iran are staggering. The claims described in the discussion include roughly $120 billion in frozen Iranian assets, along with more than $300 billion in compensation. But the real significance may not be the numbers themselves. For years, economic sanctions have been one of Washington's most powerful non-military tools against Iran.
The United States has used restrictions involving finance, oil exports, and Iranian assets abroad to create pressure on Tehran and push it toward concessions on nuclear and security issues. Removing those tools before receiving meaningful concessions from Iran would mean Washington was giving up one of its most important sources of leverage. And this is where the logic of the confrontation becomes particularly interesting. For years, the basic formula has generally been that Iran changes its behavior first, and the United States reduces pressure in return. Now, Tehran appears to be attempting to reverse that formula. Iran is effectively saying, if Washington wants Hormuz reopened, Washington must change its behavior first. That is a major shift in the bargaining equation, and there is a reason Iran can attempt it. That reason is Hormuz. The strait is not simply a narrow piece of geography. It is a critical artery for the global energy market. A major disruption can affect oil exports from the Gulf, commercial shipping, insurance costs, energy prices, and economies far beyond the Middle East. That gives Iran a form of leverage that can extend far beyond its direct confrontation with Washington.
Tehran may be able to turn a bilateral dispute into a global economic problem. And that is what makes this confrontation so dangerous. Iran understands that the United States wants the waterway functioning normally. Washington also understands that Iran cannot simply be allowed to turn one of the world's most important energy routes into a permanent instrument of political pressure. That leaves both sides with a problem. Iran needs Hormuz as leverage. The United States needs Hormuz to remain open, but neither side wants to pay the price demanded by the other. For Washington, the first major obstacle is the question of military withdrawal. The American military presence across the Middle East serves several strategic purposes. It supports allies, it provides rapid response capabilities, it protects maritime routes, and it helps maintain America's ability to project power across the region. If Washington were to withdraw those forces simply because Iran had successfully applied pressure around Hormuz, the consequences could extend beyond Iran. Other governments and strategic competitors could draw their own conclusions. They could begin to believe that sustained pressure against an American interest can produce strategic concessions. For a global power, that perception can sometimes matter almost as much as the immediate military outcome. Then there is Hormuz itself. Iran wants to transform its geographic position into strategic power. Washington, on the other hand, sees freedom of navigation as a core interest. Those two positions are fundamentally difficult to reconcile.
From Tehran's perspective, Hormuz is a powerful bargaining chip. From Washington's perspective, allowing any single country to exercise excessive control over such a critical energy corridor would create an unacceptable vulnerability. And then comes the economic problem. Sanctions, frozen assets, compensation. These issues are not easy to separate from the broader political confrontation. If Washington removes sanctions before Iran makes substantial and verifiable concessions, the United States could surrender a major bargaining tool without receiving an equivalent benefit in return. Compensation is even more complicated. Iran argues that the United States owes it compensation for damage caused by American actions. At the same time, Washington has its own claims about losses and damage caused by Iran. In other words, both sides can enter the negotiation believing that they are the injured party. And when both governments believe the other side should pay, the distance between them becomes even harder to close. But Washington cannot simply walk away. That is another part of the trap. The longer instability around Hormuz continues, the greater the potential pressure on energy markets, shipping, insurance, and the wider global economy. So Washington faces two dangerous choices. If it gives in too deeply, it risks appearing to have been forced into a strategic retreat by Tehran. If it refuses to compromise, the instability can continue, the risk of military escalation can increase, and the economic consequences can eventually spread far beyond Iran. Iran, in other words, may not need Washington to accept every demand. It may only need to convince Washington that refusing every demand is too expensive. And this may explain why Tehran is setting such a high opening price. In negotiations, an extremely high initial demand can establish a favorable starting point. It does not necessarily mean the negotiator expects to receive everything. Instead, it can shift the eventual compromise closer to its own preferred outcome. Iran may therefore be establishing a negotiating position from which even future concessions remain advantageous. But that strategy also carries enormous risks. If Tehran pushes too far, it could trigger a larger military response from the United States and its allies. The same leverage that gives Iran bargaining power can also become the trigger for escalation. And that is where the situation becomes a dangerous balancing act. Iran wants enough pressure to force Washington to negotiate, but not so much pressure that Washington decides negotiation is no longer enough. The United States faces the opposite problem. Too much compromise could weaken deterrence and create doubts among its allies. Too much pressure could push Iran toward escalation rather than compromise. Both sides therefore have reasons to avoid a prolonged war, but both also have political reasons not to appear weak.
And that creates one of the most dangerous characteristics of the confrontation. Neither side necessarily wants a larger war. Yet both sides have incentives to demonstrate that they cannot be forced to back down. That is how a crisis can become dangerous, even when neither government originally wants a major conflict. The central problem is trust. Washington wants verifiable Iranian concessions before reducing pressure. Iran wants guarantees that the United States will not simply return to sanctions or military pressure after Tehran gives up its leverage. What Washington considers a condition for building trust can therefore look to Iran like a demand for unilateral surrender. And what Iran considers a legitimate security measure can look to Washington like a threat to the regional security structure. Hormuz is where this contradiction becomes most visible. Iran can continue technical discussions over maritime issues while separating those talks from the larger political decision to fully reopen the waterway. That allows Tehran to keep negotiating without immediately surrendering its most important source of pressure. But time creates another problem. The longer the crisis continues, the greater the possibility of miscalculation. Iran can signal that stronger pressure may follow if Washington does not meet its demands. The United States can respond with continued economic and military pressure. Then the cycle repeats. Iran raises the price. Washington increases pressure. Iran becomes more resistant. Washington becomes more concerned about appearing weak. And every move by one side becomes justification for the next move by the other. But there is another variable that could disrupt the entire process: Israel. The confrontation is not controlled exclusively by Washington and Tehran. Reports referenced in the discussion indicate that Israel could maintain military options against Iran, even without direct American participation. If Israel were to launch a unilateral attack, Iran could feel compelled to respond. That response could create pressure on American forces and American allies throughout the region. And suddenly, Washington could find itself pulled back toward a military confrontation, even while American diplomats were trying to preserve a path toward negotiation. That is the paradox. The United States and Iran may both have reasons to avoid a prolonged war, but neither wants to be seen as the side that surrendered first. Iran wants to demonstrate that its leverage around Hormuz can produce results. Washington wants to demonstrate that the United States cannot be forced to rewrite its regional strategy simply because a critical maritime route is under pressure. Meanwhile, the consequences are not confined to the battlefield. A prolonged crisis around Hormuz can affect shipping routes, oil supplies, insurance premiums, and global energy prices.
The longer diplomacy fails to produce progress, the more a regional confrontation can become a global economic problem. And that gives Hormuz another role. It becomes a pressure valve. The tighter the pressure becomes around the strait, the more that pressure can travel through global markets. Higher shipping costs, higher insurance costs, higher energy prices, and greater uncertainty for economies that depend on stable energy supplies. But again, Iran must calculate the limits. If Tehran pushes the pressure beyond a certain point, it risks creating the very military response it is trying to avoid. Washington faces the same calculation. Pushing Iran too far could make escalation more attractive than compromise. So the real contest is not simply about who has the stronger military. The deeper question is, who can tolerate the pressure longer? And which side will be forced to adjust its demands first? That may be the real battlefield. Not just the sea, not just the air, but the negotiating table. Iran's demands should therefore be understood as more than a simple list of conditions for reopening Hormuz. They represent a broader struggle over position, deterrence, and influence in the Middle East after months of confrontation. Tehran may understand that Washington is unlikely to accept everything it is asking for, but that may not be the point. The strategy could be to set the opening price extremely high, use Hormuz as leverage, and move the eventual negotiating center of gravity closer to Iran's interests. And the strongest tool Iran has for doing that is geography: Hormuz. Washington, however, understands that military power alone cannot solve the problem.
The United States may possess overwhelming advantages in air power, naval power, and long-range strike capabilities. But damaging Iran is not the same thing as guaranteeing that Hormuz will remain permanently safe and open. As long as there is a risk of missiles, drones, or attacks against commercial shipping, the international market can continue to pay a price. That is why a military victory would not automatically produce a strategic solution. The strait could remain a source of instability even after individual attacks were stopped. And that is the fundamental dilemma facing Washington. A major concession could weaken American deterrence, but maximum pressure could produce an Iranian decision to escalate rather than compromise. Israel makes the equation even harder to predict. A unilateral Israeli strike could destroy weeks of diplomatic effort, trigger retaliation, and pull the United States back toward military confrontation. So the question is no longer simply who is stronger. The more important question is, who can withstand the pressure longer without making a catastrophic mistake? A negotiated settlement is still possible.
Iran does not want to surrender its strongest bargaining chip before receiving meaningful guarantees. The United States does not want to surrender military leverage, sanctions, or strategic influence simply to restore normal traffic through Hormuz. And the longer that gap remains, the greater the danger becomes. The Strait of Hormuz is therefore more than a maritime choke point. It is the center of a much larger contest. A contest over military presence, a contest over economic pressure, a contest over deterrence, and ultimately, a contest over who gets to define the terms of the next phase of the Middle East. Iran has placed an enormous bill on the table. Washington has powerful reasons to refuse it. But Washington also has powerful reasons not to let the crisis continue indefinitely. And that is why the most dangerous possibility may not be that either side deliberately chooses a new war. It may be that both sides keep pushing, each believing the other will eventually back down, until neither side can. At Hormuz, the next move may determine far more than whether ships pass safely through a narrow waterway. It could determine who controls the terms of the confrontation itself. And if diplomacy fails, the strait that Iran turned into a bargaining chip could become the spark for an entirely new regional crisis.